Hi, my name is Vicki Morrall. I'm the Accounting Partner Director here at Source Advisors. Source Advisors has been around for nearly as long as the R&D tax credit scheme itself, and we continue to provide support and assistance for accountants and their clients. Welcome to At Source, our series where we talk about all things R&D tax. Today, I'm joined by our panel of experts to talk about contracted out R&D. So we have Luke Ham, our Managing Director, Deb Chappell, our R&D Director, and Akshay Thaman, our IP and Policy Lead. So apparently, according to accountancy publications, 2/3 of accountants find that contracted out is amongst the most difficult aspects of the new R&D scheme. They find it quite difficult to get their heads round. So I guess to open this conversation, my first question I'll put to you, Luke. Why do you think that it is such an issue, and what do you think is so complex or people are finding so difficult to get their heads around regarding contracted out?
I think it's very reasonable to think this is a subject that accountants and quite a lot of people will struggle with, because it's effectively all about contracts. And it's not contracts from a legal perspective. It's about the bargain that's been struck. So if I'm using a third party, I'm going out to someone to support me in a piece of work I need, you're now thinking about what bargain was struck. So when we look at the first tier tribunals that have thought about this subject matter, the court's really focused on what was the intent of this deal? What were both parties trying to get out of it? So it's no surprise that some of the legislation has come and changed to include some of those terms.
So move across to you, Ash. Just give us an overview of what actually does contracted out mean.
Yeah, sure. So to break down contracted out into its constituent parts, essentially, initially there has to be a contract in place, and that contract can be either sort of verbal, written, or implied in some way. There has to be R&D activity contracted out. So again, as part of that contract, R&D activity has to have been sort of, essentially contracted from company A, let's say, to company B. So that has to be, and that's quite a key determination to really understand. But we'll go into that in a bit more detail, I'm sure. And the third element really is around intention and contemplation. It's a sort of bolt-on that's been added as part of the merge scheme rules that essentially says, okay, well, if I am the customer, and in this case, or in most cases, the customer will be the one that will essentially be able to claim for the qualifying expenditure related to contracted out R&D. Did they intend or contemplate that R&D of the sort would take place? And that's as part of the contract and during the contract sort of negotiation stage. So, I mean, intention and contemplation is something to really, really consider. And there's some specifics around that I'm sure we'll go into also.
And one of the other things just to add is this change has been trying to target one issue that HMRC had, which was the risk of double claiming, both companies claiming. So the intention of this is quite simple at its principle, but I think some of the practical considerations that we'll discuss a bit further are a little bit more challenging. Sure.
Just jumping back to intention and contemplation, I think that's something that we've heard quite a lot around this new scheme.
Yeah.
How important is it? Is it something that's really fundamental to the new scheme?
Yeah, so it's a requirement ultimately. So the customer, so the principal in this case, would have to show intention and contemplation. Did they intend or contemplate R&D of the sort to take place? So let's break that down also. So intention and contemplation isn't a sort of minor or fleeting consideration. It's a real sort of, let's use the word intention, but it's a real sort of move to say, look, I want an aspect of R&D to be contracted out here, whether that's testing, whether that's design, whether that's prototyping, whatever you name it in the sort of R&D sort of journey, that has to have been contracted out and had to be intended by the principal for that to take place. Now, there's another sort of phrase in there, the R&D of that sort, which is also super key here. So it's not saying that the customer had to know exactly what needed to be done from a start to end point. They just need to understand that there is an element that needs to be done here with regards to R&D. So again, company B needs to do some testing for my widget or for the component that I want to produce for my own R&D project and my own commercial goal.
Over to you, Deb. Digging into the details, what do you think the fundamental differences are between contracted out under the new merge scheme compared to the old SME scheme and RDEC?
I would say fundamentally it's on the basis that prior to the inception of the merge scheme, you had the SME scheme and you had what was RDEC scheme, we'll call it old RDEC for now. And as part of that process, so an SME claimant who subcontracted out some of their work, or contracted now, which is obviously the term we all use, they would have been able to contract that out to a supplier, and there would have been an application of 65% against that, and that fundamentally would have been eligible. Again, subject to all the usual criteria. But under RDEC, there was an absolute limitation on large companies being able to claim for general suppliers in terms of subcontracted R&D. And as such, in that circumstance, so they couldn't claim. And by virtue, if an SME claimant had work contracted to them by a large company, they were eligible to claim under RDEC. Now, as Ash has just described, with the principle and with the fact that merge scheme applies across the board, so there is this simplification, so it's irrespective of size, that would therefore generate the fact that that large company now can claim. They will also have a 65% restriction applied to those costs, but the SME, who formerly could, no longer can.
So just to make that a bit more real for people, can you give us an example of where a claimant can't claim now under the merge scheme that would have been able to under the prior SME scheme?
Yeah, no, absolutely, sure. Again, slightly using the same answer in terms of what I've said already, but just to kind of break that down. So if you've got company A, who is a large company, subcontracts to company B, under the former scheme, company B could claim if they were an SME, they were performing eligible activity, and as such, company A was ineligible, the company B gets to claim. Let's use the same two companies again, company A, company B. Now, company A under the merge scheme, who is that large company, who now has the ability to claim if they meet the requirements, as Ash has described, they can claim. So company B's lost out. Now, it is worth just pointing out the one factor in this, there are some transitional provisions as part and parcel of this change. So I think let's not forget that there are going to be circumstances where, at least in year one, there may be the ability still to continue for that company B to claim again. But this is a fundamental change. This is a fundamental change to the scheme.
And even when you think about that example, there's a few complexities that will have to be looked at on its own merits. So, for example, if it's been the intention is the client to have the benefit. They started there, and it might be a large client, it might be a small, but they're the ones who contracted out something. But if that person who's been contracted to, company B in Deb's example, if they have to then do R&D to fulfill their part, there's potentially an opportunity to think about, well, what was part of the intention and contemplation of that contract, but what else is around it? Have I done R&D to fulfill my obligations to do to that client? So there's a few things that we just don't really know how the courts or HMRC will deal with this practically.
You've all mentioned several times about the contract and the contractual relationship. So how important is that? How important is that contract between the claimant and the supplier?
I think just to jump in on that, I mean, as we're talking about intention and contemplation, and we're talking about sort of contracting out, and kind of what is it within the contract that points towards intention and contemplation. And
Absolutely.
HMRC have pointed to a few different factors with regards to that. So, IP ownership will be one of those, autonomy of either party in the project itself. So ultimately, is the principal involved, and how involved, if at all. But also the nature of the parties. If there is a company that works in a specific industry contracting out something for something quite, maybe not related to the industry that they're in, there may be some issue there. A question to say, well, okay, so how could you intend and contemplate R&D to take place if you're working in an industry that's completely removed for what you're trying to contract the activity out for? So those are just some examples of that, and it's worth considering those when reading the contract.
And the contract as well, the IP clauses will be helpful, but it's not a matter of just looking at one clause. You need to look at, and this was really, really helpful in the case law, that you need to look at the overall intent of the bargain that's been made between the parties. So the IP clause might suggest something, but then you look at things such as, well, what about termination? Who takes the work in progress? These are things that might sit completely outside of the things that you think would naturally be the things you look at. So that overall understanding of the contract, to answer your question, is critical. And that's why the best advice is to be ahead of that conversation. You can't do any of this retrospectively. If you're reviewing a contract and it falls the wrong side or doesn't match the intent of the bargain struck, well, opportunity missed. If you're ahead of that and you've got advisors around you that can think about those clauses and how it could be perceived, there's a real benefit to having that done because you have the certainty of who's going to do what at the end of this.
So throwing out to all of you, going back to the start of this conversation, I was saying how accountants find this area particularly challenging. Do you think the rules are clear? Do you think there is clarity around what contracted out means?
There's certainly simplification. I still stand by that, but I wouldn't say it's clear. No, I feel that coming back to really something you've just said there, Luke, is the fact that you have to look at it holistically. We're going to have to regard it as a whole. We've seen circumstance already when we're reviewing contracts where it's not just sufficient to see, there might be an addendum, there might be an MSA, there could be any number of aspects to it. And you have to look at it as a whole to evaluate what the position is. I think what's really interesting was something you said earlier with regards to the fact that, so you've got a contract. Contract does clearly define the R&D activity. We've covered the intention and contemplation. But what about, and something you said, Luke, what about something outside of that? Well, if it's outside of the contract, then it sits outside of it. So coming back to those points, it's so difficult for people to define easily and readily. And do they have the resource to do so? Are they expert in reading contracts? Or maybe expertise isn't required, but certainly it's going to be a skill set they're going to need to interpret the contract in a way that's going to facilitate an answer to say whether the R&D sits with the principal or potentially their client.
And just following on from that kind of definition point and examination point, firstly, my view is no, it doesn't make it clearer. I think there's a framework that we can work with here. However, it's another subjective test. Ultimately, you've got the usual rules for R&D in terms of technical advance, technical uncertainties. Was it readily deducible? They're all generally subjective things and not objective. And then now you have a test around intention and contemplation, which again, we've gone through some of those factors, but what cocktail of those factors come together to make the principal able to claim and show intention and contemplation? It feels like it's a case by case thing, something that, you'd have to assess and get a feeling for that, company A or company B intended and contemplated. So with that, I see there's potentially some issue there with, there being subjective views on either side between the claimant and HMRC around, well, I did intend and contemplate, or no, you didn't intend and contemplate.
So to expand on that one, because I think that's a really interesting point that you made there, Ash. What do you think the future lies for contracted out R&D from the point of view of conversations with challenges from HMRC? Do you think this is an area that potentially there's going to be pushback? There's going to be, if there is subjectivity, that's very difficult potentially to argue with HMRC. So do you think this is an area that we're going to see challenges in the future?
Well, I think there's and it'd be interesting to hear other thoughts. I think there's a signalling with the changes that assumes that the client, the principal, has the right to claim. So I would guess that HMRC's position will be, well, that's the starting point. You're the guys who were willing to pay for it. You intended, contemplated it more so than a fleeting moment. So we're always going to assume that you should have benefited. And if you didn't benefit, why did they? And I think that's where you could see some challenge happen. Will there be inquiries? Almost certainly, because it's an area, to Ash's point, this is subjectivity layered on subjectivity. Who knows what HMRC will make of that?
Yeah, I think the other thing you mentioned, just with regards to what sort of access and what will HMRC be thinking about. We know already that they've incepted a new element to the additional information form, so they're now actually actively asking for any claims after that period to sit within the merge scheme, who the subcontractor is. They want to know more detail with regards to, the I can't recall now off the top of my head, but I think they go so far as to checking sort of certain data criteria. That suggests that HMRC are gathering data. That suggests that they're able to do checks and balances. And they have made it abundantly clear in a circumstance where both parties claim, they will use their powers to remove one of those claims. So that comes back to your subjectivity point.
Yeah.
I think we can probably all agree that they're likely to remove the contractor rather than remove the principal. Back to your point, because it's assumed and assessed that it's the principal that's likely to be the one that can claim. So I feel that that's the area that's going to be exposed to compliance checks and taking this further down this pathway in terms of its subjectivity and who has the right to claim.
Well, I just hope you're right that they're not just data rich, but they're also data savvy.
Indeed.
HMRC have had plenty of information previously and not decided to connect the dots.
Mm-hmm.
If they connect the dots for better taxpayer outcome, fantastic. Great use of collecting the data. But they haven't got the best track record of really joining the dots when it comes to it.
So listening to everything we've been talking about in this conversation, it feels like potentially we could be at the start of what could be a messy journey. So I'll direct this one to you, Deb. Do you think there's anything particularly accountants should be thinking about and keeping in front of mind right now?
Oh, absolutely. For me, one of the key points has to be about operating in real time. I think Luke said earlier in the journey of this conversation that it cannot be retrospective. It's too late once it's passed. So, having those conversations with clients, taxpayers that in the past perhaps have been used to claiming, because I talked about earlier about the changes between the schemes. It's going to be a bit of a rude awakening if they establish that things are, status quo for what they've had in the past, to then establish that actually there's a change in the mechanism of the scheme and fundamentally they're going to lose out. And I feel that there are going to be occasions also where, large companies still want those supplier relationships. And actually there's every possibility that they don't want to lose that supplier status, and they may want to agree a position that enables the SME to claim. And I'm just using that as a simple example. But yes, real-time assessment is key for me.
And I think what I would add is we often think about this relationship being the typical David and Goliath, the large business contracting out. That's not always true. It could be very much equal parties. I think in those environments, there's an element of businesses can't always be chasing, we're so excited by the deal. What are we trading here? Now, we talk about the commercials and they'll think about how much they're getting paid and on what basis they're being paid. But there's an element here that could be quite a material overall impact to the validity and the value of that contract. So if I was in the accountant's shoes, trying to get that message to my client base, trying to get businesses to understand that the structure of the deal might need to be thought about, particularly in environments where R&D is a big driver of the relationship.
Great. So last words from you, Ash. Anything to add to bring this to a close?
Well, I think Luke and Deb have summarised it pretty well, but I think bringing the two together, ultimately, understand what your position is now, and not having any nice surprises coming into the merge scheme going forward, but then also understanding the commercial aspects of it and the opportunity. For SMEs potentially, and you might think about SMEs maybe sitting in the contractor side in a usual case potentially, that R&D might become a sort of more sort of negotiating tool. There may be costs that you were able to claim previously that you might want to factor into pricing. So it's trying to understand, can you still claim, and what should you do commercially going forward in your contracts?
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks all. Great to get your
Thank
views
you.
and
Thanks,
opinions on what is clearly quite a complex area. So I think it's been really useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic.